Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Thinking with Niall Ferguson. Niall is probably the most esteemed historian of our times, but that may not count for very much this evening because, as I was just learning before we got together, Niall flew in from the States this morning, so is jet lagged, and also, as we speak, Niall, engaged in a human experiment. Do you want to just talk about the beer?
Yes, well, I've just flown in not merely from the United States, but from California with two small boys. And anybody who's been through international travel recently will know that this is really a form of self-harm. The boys were also nursing colds, the symptoms of which are almost identical with COVID-19. So we had to kind of not only mask them, but gag them so that their symptoms wouldn't be visible. Anyway, quite an ordeal. And I warn you, if you're planning any international travel, just don't do it. In order to prepare myself for this conversation, I thought I needed a wee refreshment, as they say in Scotland, but only was able to find some out-of-date Guinness. And so we're running an experiment to see if Guinness becomes toxic after the sell-by date. If my doom turns out to be death by Guinness, it will be very appropriate, and Norman Stone will look down fondly my demise.
There'll be a lot. It's also possible the opposite is the case, that you may, in the course of this next hour, discover extra strength Guinness, which might be the biggest contribution that you've made, even notwithstanding all the other ones.
It's a wildly reckless thing to do, James, because all my worst gaffes, and we'll make these gaffes, but the things we're now remembered for. All my worst gaffes happened when I was jet lagged. Right. And jet lag plus out-of-date Guinness is a recipe for doom. Personal self-cancellation is probably only minutes away. But at least I'm not Gareth Bale. As it happens, I'm in Wales, and one could feel a kind of shudder pass through the land as he missed a penalty earlier this evening. So that's the kind of doom that I think it would be very, very hard to cope with. A few gaffes over out-of-date Guinness will not finish me off, I hope.
I think, Niall, just to be clear, I think you've already committed your first one. I think you're not allowed, if you're in Wales, to say, at least I'm not Gareth Bale. It's already a whole set of issues.
I could have said, at least I'm not Scottish, but I am Scottish. And we of course, are going through our own peculiar form of national agony in this tournament, and that's part of the reason for being in Wales. I think it'll somehow be easier to cope with England's thrashing of Scotland tomorrow, or is it Thursday, or is it Friday, whenever it is. I've lost all track of time if I'm in Wales.
Well, let's get stuck into doom, and possibly not even within the context of the Euros, because the thing is that's amazing about the book, which is obviously a choice, is that you do go from, moments of Monty Python to sweeping histories of China and the Asian record on disasters and calamities. I wanted to start with something though, because lots of people won't yet have had the chance to read the book. There's obviously something which is kind of ambitious, some would even say courageous, about trying to draw history's lessons from over such a sweep of the past into a story that's not yet finished. And I wondered whether or not, having come to the end of the book, you thought, actually, there is a history lesson. For all its complexity, there is a lesson of history here.
There is. I'll give you a two-parter. Part one is that we shouldn't draw a distinction between natural and man-made disasters. This is really an old idea that I borrowed from Amartya Sen, but he applied it to famines. And I make the argument that really all disasters ultimately have to have a man-made or human component. Even a volcano is only a disaster when it erupts if you've built a great big city at the foot of it. Same applies to earthquakes. So that's the first observation, that we have this intuition that there's a difference between a natural and man-made disaster, and then something like COVID happens, and it turns out that the virus itself may be a product of human error, though we can't at this point be sure if the lab leak hypothesis is right. And even if it's wrong and the thing was a natural mutation, it's still clear that politics played a huge part in deciding how different countries performed in the face of this challenge. So that's the first observation, that all catastrophes are at some level political. The second observation is that when disaster strikes, there's this very strong impulse to blame the person at the top. In the US, it was Donald Trump. Here in the UK, it was Boris Johnson. In Brazil, it's Jair Bolsonaro. In India, it's Narendra Modi. And that impulse is very easy to understand if you have a populist leader who is loathed by large sections of the liberal-leaning press. But I try to show in the book that the point of failure in a disaster is rarely right at the top. I mean, you can say responsibility lies at the top. The buck stops here, Harry Truman's famous line. But what I try to show in the book is that the point of failure is generally not right at the top. It's often in middle management, in the heart of the bureaucracy in most modern disasters. And I illustrate this point with the case of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which blew up shortly after its launch, an episode that I really found it fascinating to revisit. That the impulse of the White House press corps was to somehow pin it on Ronald Reagan. But in reality, it was all because of a man named Mr. Kingsbury, an obscure NASA official who ignored the engineers when they said there was a 1 in 100 chance the thing would blow up, by turning that into 1 in 100,000. Mm-hmm. So that's the second big idea. But I mean, in the end, this is a book about disasters through history. It's not specifically a book about COVID-19, a disaster that is not yet over. And I just thought it would help. It certainly helped me psychologically to put the events of 2020-21 in some kind of historical context.
There's a certain glee, I think, in the opening chapter when you sort of start looking at our own mortality and the curious way in which we dance around death, that we don't really engage with it. And you head straight into it. You know, the time horizon on your own life, the prospect actually of all human life sooner or later being extinct. And in that section on doom, are you trying to make a point about just socially, the way in which we somehow insulate ourselves against what is inevitable?
Yes, I think part of what made 2020 traumatic was that we are in a strangely ambivalent relationship with death individually and on a large scale. I'm a little bit Woody Allen about this. I'm not sure if you're allowed to mention him anymore, but I remember all those early Woody Allen movies when he's worrying endlessly, neurotically about death. And you know, I've always had a similar kind of feeling that this is all a bit weird, and that the terminus is one that we don't really talk that much about. And I remember reading Evelyn Waugh's The Loved One as a schoolboy and loving the book because he makes huge fun of the way Americans deal with death, which is to sort of put makeup on it and not even to call it death, because, as you know, people in the United States pass. Mm-hmm. And I can never prevent myself from using the D word when somebody says that somebody passed, because to me, passing is something that you do in football, and I just can't let it pass. This problem that we have is that we are in denial about our mortality, I think, more than ever. Philippe Ariès had this great book many years ago, The Hour of Our Death, showing that we just are far, far more divorced from death as a culture than we were in the medieval or early modern period, or even in the Victorian period. So there's this kind of individual denial, which is very obvious where I live in California most of the time, where the 80-year-olds are out there playing tennis, and over dinner they'll tell you about the new business that they're launching. And I mean, I've even heard a nonagenarian talk about his new business. So there is a very strong sense of immortality, and indeed Silicon Valley is just where people invest money in companies that are supposed to give immortality. But immortality really isn't on offer. It's almost certainly an unattainable thing. And kind of with Borges, that it would be awful if we attained it. The second thing that follows from that is that when a disaster happens and there's suddenly a big increase in mortality above expectation, and an increase in your probability of dying prematurely, then we are kind of freaked out. And people were talking last year as if nobody should die, that really any level of death was unacceptable. And I had to keep reminding people that people would die in very large numbers even without a novel coronavirus. It wasn't even the top killer in 2020 in the United States. It came in third after heart disease and cancer, which continue to do their grim work regardless of pandemics. So part of the reason for writing Doom was, I think, to confront my own strange relationship to mortality. Like most historians, I rather prefer the company of dead people and like to pore over their correspondence, secure in the knowledge that they won't answer back. But also to tackle the fact that we don't really think very rationally about death. And we're kind of very attracted to large numbers. 3.4 million people have died of COVID. This is a calamity without parallel. It's unprecedented. That's actually a really small percentage of the world's population. And it doesn't really mean that we're in the midst of a historically top 10 pandemic. It's only just got into the top 20.
By the way, you'll talk about people's kind of appetite and expectations of life into their 80s and 90s. I remember, Neil, reading an obit in the New York Times of some New York lawyer who had lived to 106. And one of the things I loved about it was he'd started learning Spanish at 102. And when asked why he was learning Spanish, he said, well, if you look at the demographic trends in the United States. That was. But listen, can I just, I want to go back to your two big points in a moment, but just this point about tolerance of death, right? One of the questions that's been live within government, certainly in the UK, and I know within the US too, has been, what's an acceptable level of mortality from COVID? And the reason I think this has been so difficult, if you speak to people who worked inside the Downing Street, what they say is, look, we have an understanding around terrorism, right? We have a zero acceptance of mortality. Right. What we can't do is seem to get the politicians around the table and come to an acceptable level of mortality around COVID. And obviously that has impact on all the things we're seeing now, hospitals, lockdowns, etc. Is there anything that you've seen where governments in the past have looked at these kinds of crises, these kinds of catastrophes, and said, yes, we can tolerate X level of deaths?
There was a British politician who once used the phrase with respect to Northern Ireland, an acceptable level of violence. And of course, it got him into terrible trouble. You're not supposed to say things like that out loud. But of course, throughout warfare, right into the modern period, there is, not publicly, but within the military and within the political class, a recognition that there is some threshold above which you can't go in terms of lost lives without having a serious problem on your hands. And what was striking about the period of our lifetimes is that threshold came down very sharply, to the point that by the 1990s, it seemed as if, from the vantage point of Bill Clinton's administration, a single body bag would rule out sustained intervention in the Bosnian war. In the end, they overcame that, but there was a period when it seemed as if even a single American life was too much of a price to pay. The same argument was made with respect to Rwanda. So I think in the setting of warfare, there is some socially acceptable level of death. And it varies enormously from society to society. The Soviet Union was able to withstand crazily high mortality in World War II. It's hard to believe that democracies could ever have put up with that without some kind of collapse of morale. But totalitarian states are quite good at discarding lives and remaining in business. I think when it comes to pandemics, it's a bit different, partly because when we say to ourselves, we're up against a germ rather than say Germans, our attitudes change, partly because each pandemic has a different age profile of its victims. And COVID is very odd because it's so ageist. Most pandemics in history kill the very young as much as the very old, and some go after people in the prime of life. And that, I think, has a significant bearing on what a society is prepared to put up with. When you look at the world today, it's clear that there is really enormous variation. And the best measure of this is just to look at excess mortality. There are some countries that really have no excess mortality to show for the last 18 months. Taiwan only just got a wave last month of COVID infections and deaths, but the numbers are still tiny, in the low hundreds by comparison with the United States or the UK. But the US and the UK's excess mortality actually isn't that remarkable. It's kind of middle of the table when you look at countries like Peru and Ecuador, where excess mortality has been extraordinarily high. And I think excess mortality is the best measure. You're essentially asking how many people are dying compared to what you'd expect on the basis of the last 5 or 10 years. That's quite a useful way of approaching the problem, because you don't then get into this definitional issue of was somebody dead because of COVID, or did they die but had COVID, maybe not as the principal cause of death.
Can I ask you, can we go to your first sort of big point, this point about the overlap between natural disasters and man-made disasters? And in that context, a lot of certainly the sort of last quarter of the book is around preparedness and the extent to which governments handle this. And I'm actually going to ask Roger Dennis, who you won't have seen it in the chat, has made a point that about this within New Zealand's case, that New Zealand's had a good set of numbers, but not necessarily been prepared. And Roger Dennis messaged me and said that he wrote a report in 2015 about preparedness. Roger, do you want to tell us a little bit about that and so how you see things?
Yes, so I'd start that with a caveat that in New Zealand now I think I crawled out of bed at 5:20 and probably looked like that this morning.
No one's in the proper time zone, as you can hear, Roger, so you're actually at the same time zone as Neil.
So my professional capacity is helping leaders of organisations sort of make sense of a rapidly changing world and converting that into a strategic response. And so in the response to the Ebola outbreak in 2015, I wondered just how ready New Zealand was as a country for a pandemic should Ebola escape from West Africa. And so along with 2 colleagues, I spent about 4 months analysing New Zealand's level of preparation for a pandemic should it ever get to that stage. We spent time working with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, with senior leaders in the Ministry of Health, with Civil Defence Emergency Management, and many of New Zealand's top corporates, particularly their supply chain specialists. We wrote a report that was 142 pages in the public domain, and the response to that report was essentially this. Nothing. And
your point is that New Zealand's had a good run of it by luck, not by preparedness.
Oh yes, having been extensively involved in a private sector response when it became clear that officials weren't taking this as seriously as they should have in late January, early February last year, I can tell you it was just luck that we are where we are. Luck, and I think 5 million people seems like a tipping point where a small nation can respond with a lot more agility than larger nations, whether it's a federal-state split. That seems to be a factor, but certainly, it was luck in the first few weeks that got us to where we are.
Roger, thank you. Neil, what do you make of that?
Well, it's fascinating because I was talking to Audrey Tang, who's the digital minister in Taiwan and has played an important part in the Taiwanese response. And she said, well, almost in passing, the New Zealanders just copied us, by which I think she meant that New Zealand adopted the strategy of repressing, preventing the spread of the virus. But I agree with Roger's point that it was able to because of luck. In terms of proximity, effective proximity rather than geographical proximity to Wuhan, New Zealand wasn't too close. The direct flights were crucial in the early phase of spreading the virus, and so the United States and the UK were among those countries that had direct flights from Wuhan. So New Zealand had a bit more time than the US and the UK had, and as Roger says, it's a relatively smaller and not very densely populated country. One often forgets how large New Zealand is It's a vastly larger landmass than Scotland with comparable population. So for these reasons, it was possible in New Zealand to kind of somewhat belatedly copy the Taiwanese response of just preventing the virus from getting going. But you needed that little bit of time to do that. Another critical point is the way in which this particular virus works. It's got a very low dispersion factor, which means that 80% of the spreading is done by about 20% of infected people. And some countries were unlucky. They got super spreaders and super spreader events in the early phase in January and February, and other countries didn't. It's a little bit like there need to be multiple burning pieces of matter to start a wildfire, not one. You need actually several before you get the fire to take off, because it all depends where the burning cinder lands. So this is, I think, a very good illustration of the point that the countries, they may have been prepared on paper, and some were. The United States and the UK on paper had preparedness plans for pandemic, but in practice, what really mattered was your speed of response and how much time you had to respond.
And what do you make? One of the things that there are a couple of things that are in tension within the book. One is that it's very hard to predict these things, but it's very important to prepare for them. How do you reconcile that?
Well, one of the most important points that Doom makes is that you can't predict disasters. And that's important because there's a huge business and indeed a culture of disaster prediction. Journalists know that a piece predicting a disastrous event is more likely to get published than one that says the probability is very low of such an event. But the idea that you could somehow with a model anticipate when the next fill in the blank, financial crisis, war, disastrous climate-related event would happen, this is, I think, a kind of pathology of our time. In reality, the historical process is too complex to model, and we can see the extreme difficulty of prediction in a whole range of different areas, including pandemics. We all knew that there was some possibility of a pandemic. We've been talking about it for decades. As Rod just said, many people at the time of Ebola were sitting around wondering if Ebola would become a global pandemic. But there's actually really very little that tells you when the big one will come. And so we were all writing about this for years and years and years. And none of us could say with any confidence that it would happen in 2020. There was just no way of doing that. And the same applies to a whole range of disasters. We know there'll be a big earthquake in California at some point. There hasn't been a really big one for a long time, but we have no idea when it will happen. And I could go on in this vein. The truth is, disasters don't lie in the realm of risk where you can attach some ex-ante probability. They're really in the realm of uncertainty. And that means that we can't just spend our lives listening to every Cassandra who gets some column inches, because there are too many Cassandras predicting too many disasters, and we would be completely paralyzed if we tried to heed all of their prophecies. So what the book argues is that you can't really meticulously prepare for every contingency, although our bureaucracies sometimes act like they can. The most important thing is rapidity of response the minute the disaster flags itself. Now, I thought it was pretty obvious by mid-January 2020 that there was going to be a global pandemic. To me, it was just surreal to be at Davos in January, to be in Washington in February, and even into March to find people in complete denial that there was going to be a global pandemic that would affect pretty much every country. So people were very slow in the uptake early last year. And I think that was because they didn't have the pattern recognition skill that you need to know when something's starting. You can't know when it's going to start, but you should be able to spot when it's starting. And this one had, pandemic written all over it, new and mysterious outbreak in China. That's a red flag right there, because so many big pandemics have begun in East Asia. And then, of course, Chinese Communist Party denies human-to-human spread. Well, the Taiwanese knew not to believe that. The rest of us were kind of drinking the Kool-Aid with the World Health Organization, so we wasted weeks.
And how do you explain optimism bias?
Well, I think there's a tendency, particularly in countries where things have generally gone well, like the United States, to assume that the US will be fine. And I encountered this repeatedly at the beginning of 2020. I can recall some pretty heated discussions in Washington around the time of a Hoover Institution board meeting, in which I was sort of saying to people, you've got to understand this thing is really serious and you're doing far too little. And the response was, well, it could be no worse than the seasonal flu, and we would then cause this great economic disruption for no reason. And, let's just see how it plays out. Now, this is a particular form of optimism bias, which might be better defined as kick the can down the road itis. Particularly if you're in a democracy, there's a strong inclination to just play for time and hope for the best, because taking early action with some cost to it. I mean, suppose they'd really shut down travel from China into the US in January. That would have had a cost. It would have been economically quite disruptive in a whole variety of ways. It's much more tempting not to do that and hope for the best than to do it, because if you do it and it turns out not to be a bigger deal than the seasonal influenza, then you've really made a major mistake. But even if you do it and you were right to do it, even if it was absolutely the right thing to do, there are very poor payoffs in democracy for averted disasters. And this is the problem of conjecture that Henry Kissinger talks about way back in the 1950s and 60s. And I came across it writing his biography. The problem of conjecture is you are basically incentivized as the democratic leader not to take early, costly action. You're incentivized to kick the can down the road. And that, I think, is another way of thinking about optimism bias. You're kind of like Mr. Micawber, hoping that something will turn up.
Can you just explain that example, Neil? Where and why did Kissinger come to that conclusion?
Kissinger was observing the difficulty of making grand strategy foreign policy, to use a more unpretentious term, in the context of the Cold War. The antagonist, the Soviet Union, was not a democracy, and therefore its leaders were able, as Kissinger saw it in the 50s and 60s, to engage in significant expenditures to upgrade and upscale their nuclear arsenal. And the United States, meanwhile, as he saw it, was inclined to take a fairly sanguine view of how things would play out. That the Cold War is an issue which illustrates the point quite well, because the US, I think, with a few exceptions, US leaders did not really imagine losing the Cold War. Kissinger was unusual because he could imagine losing. He, as Walter Isaacson argued many years ago, was just temperamentally more pessimistic. After all, he'd grown up in Germany in the 1920s and left in the mid-30s as a Jewish refugee. But most American leaders don't actually at any point think they're going to lose the Cold War. And so there's a somewhat complacent view in which, for someone like Kissinger, you had to constantly push back against, because there was a significant risk, certainly by the time he came to power under Nixon, that the US would really lose in the wake of the fiasco in Vietnam, and with the Soviets aggressively expanding their operations in all kinds of parts of what we used to call the Third World. So the problem of conjecture is a democratic politician's problem. And I actually think it's got more obvious since the end of the Cold War. It seems to me that democratic leaders have got steadily worse at persuading populations to make any kind of early preemptive sacrifice. And kicking the can down the road is now really the definitive act of statesmanship, especially in Europe.
Neil, there's so much to come back on that, but there are a host of people who've got kind of thoughts and questions they want to put to you, and I want to bring some of them in. There's a chapter on the book about networks, and one of the curiosities is that you read that chapter and you think, actually, these days, being really networked feels a little bit more like building your town close to the volcano. It's not altogether a positive. And David Lane was making the point about Taiwan and South Korea and its agility, but also its kind of technological ability. David, do you want to put that point to Neil and how you read that?
Thanks, James. And Neil, hello. Hello from Edinburgh, actually. And thank you for the book. I have to say, this is bizarre for me. I've been listening to your book in the bath, and it's bizarre to be on a Zoom call with the voice. Anyway, and it's wonderful. I love the point you made about, it was the nations that were the most agile, stressed by their neighbors, not the ones who had the best plans, because you don't know what the next exogenous shock is going to be. But it did occur to me that there are preparations you can make in the form of the tools that you have that you can use to get the fast response you're talking about. And it's beyond Zoom and good broadband and so on. So my question is, in your conversations with leaders, your studies, did you get a sense of what the tools were that these nations were using that gave them the ability to have that agile response? Because obviously we'd like to build some of them too.
Yes, thanks. Great question. And the bath is the perfect place to listen to doom, considering how many people lose their lives in baths each year, usually by slipping on the way in or out. So be careful. I wanted to understand this better. So I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs, the argument of which was general paranoia is better than meticulous preparation for the wrong disaster. And then I ran it past Audrey Tang, the minister I mentioned earlier, who's led a kind of transformation of Taiwan's government. Audrey Tang is an unusual person who really started as a kind of cyberpunk rebel in one of the many Occupy movements of about 10 years ago. And the Taiwanese government, in an unorthodox move, essentially brought Audrey from outside the tent into the tent and said, well, if you're so clever, why don't you use technology to make our government more responsive to citizens? And they started with, I think Audrey's first project was a program to improve the digital education of Taiwanese kids. That was so successful that they went to a whole bunch of other stuff. And broadly speaking, what the Taiwanese have done is to create some platforms that allow voters greater access to the decision-making process. That means there's greater transparency on the side of the government, and it means that rather than referendums, you just have a constant back and forth on issues that policymakers are grappling with. When the pandemic struck, they had the same problem that most countries had. They didn't have enough masks or other protective equipment, but they used a website to allocate the scarce resources. They were transparent about the shortage, whereas in the US, the public health officials lied and said, you don't need masks, and then, of course, had to change their view later and say, actually, you do need masks, and in the process, entirely undermined public trust. Audrey Tang's a fascinating person, and she said to me that the key is to make government more accountable to the people. That's what technology can do, as opposed to mainland China, which makes the people more accountable to the government. Contact tracing is another good example of this. They built a contact tracing app. They didn't need to use it last year because they were so effective at preventing the spread of the virus. But this year, when they had an outbreak back in the earlier part of last month, they were able to get that contact tracing app up and running with very rapid adoption. So Taiwan, I think, is one of the countries, and South Korea is another, that have pioneered using technology in ways that empower citizens. We in the West are slightly inclined to say, oh no, all of this is terrible. Our civil liberties. We are, the English-speaking peoples. We don't want a contact tracing app. And this is a naive view, because in reality, we put up with far greater violations of our liberties in the English-speaking world than the Taiwanese did. I mean, the levels of government stringency in the lockdown phase were much higher than at any point in Taiwan until the last 4 or 5 weeks. So I think there is a whole bunch of fascinating answers to the question, and Taiwan is probably the place to start looking. Unfortunately, our leaders were so startled and impressed by the mainland Chinese response, which was, as you know, draconian lockdowns after the initial outbreak, that we kind of followed their example. And the other, Niall Ferguson, not me, the epidemiologist at Imperial College, admitted that just the other day in an interview. He said, we weren't sure we could do communist policies in a democracy, but, the Chinese showed us how to do lockdowns. We weren't sure we could do it in a free society, but it turned out we could. I read that and I thought, you guys were looking at the wrong China. You should have looked at the Republic of China.
Neil, I want to come to this. First, I just want to take a nod to the fact that one of the things that's really surprising about the book is that historically, the greatest number of catastrophes, big loss of life, natural disasters, have been in Asia rather than in the West, which is perhaps because we're self-involved, not the way we necessarily see things. And actually, they've been outsized catastrophes in centuries prior to the 20th century, which again, probably because we're self-involved, is not the way we see things. When you're mapping catastrophes in world history, is there a logic to where they've happened and when?
Yes. The story is partly just demographic. East Asia has long had very large populations and very densely populated urban areas, and that's part of the story. That if one goes back over a millennium, one realizes how thinly populated many Western societies were for much of that time, compared with the huge population that was sustained in imperial China. The second problem is that, well, the second point is that if you look at a map of the world by fault lines, or a map of the world by major volcanic eruptions, and if that was all you knew about the world, you'd conclude that human beings really like to settle next to fault lines and volcanic caldera, because an enormous number of major East Asian cities are in very vulnerable places. Japan is just a kind of disaster waiting to happen from a geological point of view. In the book, I tell the story of the Japanese battle to try to predict earthquakes because the stakes are so high in Japan, and their recurrent failure to get the timing and location of the next big earthquake right. So I think that one of the lessons I learned writing the book is that all kinds of things happen everywhere. Wildfires happen, floods happen, you name it. I'll give you an example, but the East Asian disasters are always about an order of magnitude bigger, if not more, than the North American disasters. And North American disasters, which are etched in the memory, often turn out to be quite small. And we have this problem with sizing. Often we're just terrible at orders of magnitude and attach huge importance to disasters that don't kill that many people. I mentioned the Space Shuttle Challenger. Actually, 7 people died because it didn't kill anybody except the crew. It attracted enormous national attention. It was a psychologically scarring event because so many people watched it on TV. 7 people died. But you go and look at some of the big disasters of the same period in China, Banqiao Dam in the 1970s, a catastrophic dam failure, which killed far more people than any equivalent flooding event in North American history, and is an event that I certainly didn't know about until I started writing Doom.
No, and this is the same, the Changsha fire, or these things, when you catalogue them, they're just extraordinary. I want to just make that Asia point because it's one of those elements of the book that sort of takes you by surprise. But the second big idea that you mentioned right at the top is perhaps the one that's the really challenging one, emotionally, if you like, because as you say, we really want to take it out. We've got a kind of disorganized response around these disasters, and our attention is trained on leadership. And I just wanted to bring in Chris Ettery because Chris is asking this question about the point you make in the book about operator error versus manager error, leaders versus bureaucrats. Chris, I just wonder what your perspective is, before hearing from Neil on it.
Yeah, I mean, I find it really interesting, this concept of, the fault lies more in the heart of the bureaucracy rather than at the top. And I suppose from a personal perspective, I mean, I very often see where you have errors, it's major errors are generally due to a large number of small elements going wrong rather than single catastrophic changes. But as you made that point, I was Rolodexing through the historical context. I'm just really interested to understand, in this sort of sense of some of the major issues that we've seen in the past, sort of going back further into time, like, the types of scenarios we could imagine that cause such, they, rather than the leaders knowing that the world was a lot more of a hierarchical in nature, how that role of the bureaucracy could still play a role in terms of causing such events to happen.
Thanks,
I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's one of my favorite insights of the book, which, like all my good ideas, comes from somebody else, Richard Feynman, the Caltech physicist, who makes the point about middle management in his account of the Challenger space shuttle disaster. But there are plenty other examples. I mean, the Titanic is a very famous disaster because of the movie, and it's actually been kept alive in popular culture for a remarkably long time. At the time, enormous public opprobrium was heaped on the chairman of the White Star Line, but I mean, it really wasn't his fault. So your next question is, well, whose fault was it? And the best answer to that question is kind of nobody's, really, because the truth about the Titanic was that even if you'd had more lifeboats on board, that's the usual standard answer, there weren't enough lifeboats. But even if there had been enough lifeboats, the crew were not sufficiently well trained in an emergency evacuation for there to have been a significantly greater number of people saved. I've just given the game away. I keep telling myself when I'm doing podcasts, don't tell them the truth about the Titanic. It's the one reason they might buy the book. But actually, there's so many bad explanations for the Titanic that it's great to kind of finally sit down, as I tried to do with all the literature, and come up with the right answer. And the right answer I found in a very obscure article by an experienced Atlantic sailor, a naval officer at that time, who writes this brilliant coruscating demolition of all the then current explanations. There's a famous air disaster, the most disastrous air accident in history, which was when two jumbo jets collided in Tenerife. Entirely forgotten now, but it was a big deal back in the 1970s. Explaining why that happened is a perfect illustration, Chris, of your point, that disasters often turn out to have lots and lots of little errors combining together to produce what people sometimes call the perfect storm. But I'm very critical of the idea of perfect storms in the book. The perfect storm itself was not a perfect storm. It's just kind of shit happens. It's when a lot of things go wrong at once. Now, in the case of COVID, and this is something the journalists on the call will appreciate, there was a strong imperative, editorial imperative and network imperative, to blame Trump in the US and to blame Boris in the UK. And they made enough errors and put themselves sufficiently center stage for that to be plausible. But in reality, the excess mortality in the US and the UK arose from a bunch of decisions that had nothing to do with them. CDC failed to ramp up testing. Similar failure happened in the UK. Testing was key to early containment. You had to know who was infected. We had no idea. Way into this thing, we had no idea because we completely screwed up testing. That was nothing to do with Trump or Johnson. In the US, it was because CDC decided to try and centralize testing and then issued a test that didn't work. An amazing bureaucratic failure. Why did we have no contact tracing? Did Trump veto it? No, big tech vetoed it because Apple and Google decided that it would not be smart for them to be seen to be rolling out a contact tracing app. They thought there would be blowback. Again, nothing to do with decisions taken at the top. And when it came to isolating the infected and protecting the vulnerable, these failures, which happened in almost every Western country, had much more to do with regional level decision-making than with decisions at the top. Add those things together, you get most of the excess mortality.
Neil,
imagine a different prime minister being in office. Imagine Jeremy Corbyn as prime minister. Imagine that somehow or other Joe Biden had got the job of president early. Would we really have had less excess mortality? Maybe a little, but not much.
Neil, let me just. I want to bring in Sudi Piggott because Sudi had a response to this and was uncomfortable. I think a lot of people will probably feel the same way about, in effect, exonerating Johnson and Hancock.
And I'm not exonerating that. They were really incompetent and did a very bad job. But that's not the reason that we had very high excess mortality in the US and the UK. And if we tell ourselves that it was them and getting rid of them will make sure that the next disaster will go better, then we're deluding ourselves in a quite serious way.
Sudi.
I mean, I kind of understand what you're saying to some extent, but I think, you know, as individuals, especially those who, you know, don't approve of what they're doing, I think we need to have, I mean, we probably need to have someone to blame. And there's so many obvious things apart from the test and tracing cock up. I mean, you know, they're not closing the airports, they're not closing down India and things. I mean, that was completely Boris Johnson's fault. We know that lots of people were advising him differently. So, you know, I can't imagine he's listening to this, but, you know, he would love to feel that he was, you know, finding a different way of kind of getting off the hook, wouldn't he?
I really want to make it clear that doom doesn't let the populists off the hook. It doesn't. I'm really quite explicitly critical of their errors of judgment. And Trump's was significantly greater. But here's a counterexample. Trump was the one person in Washington who really wanted to stop flights coming from China in January. And he was reviled in the New York Times and on CNN for this racist, xenophobic proposal. That he pushed ahead, and there was actually
he framed it in the wrong way.
But it was too late.
Yeah.
It was too late to be effective. I mean, if it'd been done 2 weeks earlier, and if they'd included US passport holders, it might have done something. But nearly all the travel restrictions, and there are great studies to show this, nearly all the travel restrictions that were introduced too late. And it's actually quite interesting. If you look at the literature on this, travel bans were not an important effective policy measure compared with a range of other things. Almost nobody introduced travel bans early enough to make a big difference. So to emphasize that as the reason that the UK had a serious problem of excess mortality is actually not right. It's not really the Heathrow closure that was, or non-closure that was decisive. I think what was fascinating about Dominic Cummings's testimony a couple of weeks ago was that although some of the headlines, like the New York Times headline, said Cummings denounces his boss Johnson for incompetence, that wasn't really what Dom Cummings was saying. What he was saying was that there had been a system-wide failure that extended from the elected politicians through the civil servants to the public health officials, and that's what we need to be concerned about. And I actually thought Cummings's testimony and his Twitter thread were about the best analysis of what went wrong in Britain last year that we've actually had so far, precisely because it didn't overemphasize Boris Johnson's role.
Sudi, thank you. Well, let's take this to right where we are now. It was interesting, Neil, we had Gordon Brown on last night, and was weighing in on the question around the G7 and the deal on vaccines, right? And this is a moment where we can pause and stop and say, actually, this is a question of leadership. There is a question about the extent to which the West, the wealthiest nations, are going to commit to funding a vaccine rollout. They went into Cornwall talking about the need for 11 billion and came out of the weekend committing to that 11 billion, leaving 10 billion vaccines still to be found and funded. That surely is a moment where you can look at it and say, this is not a question of bureaucracy. This is not a manager error. This is an operator error. This is about leadership.
Clearly, until we have a global and effective vaccination campaign, we're going to be dealing with COVID-19 because new variants will come along, and there could be one far worse than Delta, as we must learn to call the previously Indian variant. I was joking gloomily with a medical friend the other day. It's Omega. It's the Omega variant I worry about. We're going to have a great many variants under the circumstances. What's the problem? Well, we know that it's possible to have successful global vaccination campaigns and eradicate disease, because we did it with smallpox.
Yeah.
Larry Brilliant was a key player in that story, and Larry Brilliant's somebody I got to know in the last year and a half. I've learned a lot from him, and he would certainly agree that this is a major policy failure. On the other hand, I think he'd also agree that it would be very difficult indeed to will a very rapid global vaccination campaign into existence, given our current resources and the practical challenges that confront us in many parts of the world when it comes to mass vaccination. I think it's a mistake to expect world leaders to produce miracles. On the other hand, I think it would have been a very different story if the same result had come out of a G7 summit attended by Donald Trump. I'm constantly amazed by the double standards of the coverage. That if the same result had come out of a G7 attended by Trump, it would have been total and utter abject failure, a scandalous dereliction of duty by the US. Biden gets a very, very easy ride. But in truth, I mean, I think in truth, if one looks back at the eradication of smallpox, this is not going to be done in 12 months' time. This is going to take a lot longer than that, as the eradication of smallpox did. And it will take time for one very simple reason. Only the mRNA vaccines really work. That's the bad news. The Chinese vaccines have very low efficacy. Countries that vaccinated with Sinopharm and the other Chinese vaccines have not brought the pandemic under control. Look at Chile. And so the problem is that it's not just we need to vaccinate the world, we need to vaccinate the world with the highly efficacious vaccines, which are basically the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. That's the problem. And in some ways, it's a good problem because there was a scenario in which none of the vaccines worked very well. When the results of the phase 3 trials came in from Pfizer, I was kind of breaking out the champagne because it was much better than I'd expected. And that means that we can get there. The problem is it's not numbers of vaccines that total numbers of vaccines that matter. It's the number of vaccines with high efficacy. And that's the challenge.
But Neil, don't you think that there will be some people who are listening to you and some people who read the book and will say, look, there's a kind of recipe of fatalism here, which is you can't resort to history to predict these things, right? You are going to have to be prepared, right? Or if not prepared, quick on your feet in responding. But it's almost impossible to respond at a leadership level because the levers are not at your disposal, because the if you like, the whole machinery is so rusted and sclerotic, that you can't actually get any change. And as a result of it, the best you can do is have a kind of greater acceptance of catastrophe and disaster as part of the course of the human experience. Is that a reasonable conclusion from the book and the conversation we're having?
No, I'm actually much more optimistic than that. And in some ways, the title of the book, Doom, is an ironical one. In reality, we've got a whole lot better than we used to be at understanding the threats we face. I mean, imagine how a medieval society engaged with the challenge posed by bubonic plague. They had no understanding of the disease whatsoever and had to resort to all kinds of religious responses, which had no efficacy at all. No, I think our reasons to be cheerful are quite numerous. The problem, and this is really the key takeaway, is not that we don't understand the problems, the nature of disaster. The problem is that we've got less good at responding rapidly. And I draw a contrast between the governments of 2020 and the governments of the 1950s, and specifically between Trump and Eisenhower. I think we have got less good over time at turning our scientific knowledge into effective government action. The 1950s is an interesting time in a whole range of ways. But if you look at the way they dealt with the comparably serious pandemic of the Asian flu of 1957-58, there was a much more rapid and efficient response than we've seen in our time. We talk all the time about infrastructure these days. Well, the Eisenhower administration was able to build the interstates in a way that really puts to shame anything that we're likely to achieve in the near future. So I argue in the book, government competence has degenerated even as the number of people employed and the number of government agencies has gone up. That's fixable. The good news is that technology, and this goes back to the question David asked, the technology allows the public sector to be more responsive. The enemy is bureaucracy. The culture of bureaucracy is to produce a 36-page pandemic preparedness plan, which covers everybody's ass at the agency concerned, but doesn't work. And this is the most important thing I think that Dom Cummings said. We had a plan, but it was either useless or non-existent. The same was true in the US. There are pages and pages of pandemic preparedness plans. I've plowed through them. There was one in 2018, 36 pages of pandemic preparedness. On paper, the US and the UK were the best prepared countries. but they weren't, because this was bureaucratic preparedness and it didn't work. It disintegrated on contact with a new pathogen. So the good news, and I'm much more optimistic than you made me seem there, James, the good news is that we actually have a very fixable problem. It is rocket science to produce an mRNA vaccine. That's the hard bit. It is easy, by comparison, to distribute it. It's easy. It's not a complex problem. The difficulty is the bureaucratic rigidities that have grown steadily worse over time, that make us look like complete plodders compared with the generation that planned D-Day and then handled all the crises of the 1950s.
It's so interesting, this. I mean, we had a conversation with John Micklethwaite and Adrian Waldridge a few months ago, where they were saying very, very similar things. This enormous frustration with the bureaucracy that's kind of come to sort of, in their minds, taken hold, and clearly in yours too. Can I just one final question, because I see the time, and it looks as though you're going to survive the Guinness, which is a relief.
Well, who knows?
Who knows?
It may be slow-acting poison.
You said something really interesting about the comparison between Taiwan and mainland China, and this point that Audrey Tang had made about technology being used to make government rules more accountable to the people, or, as in mainland China, the people more accountable to government. And it's felt, certainly since probably the spring of last year, maybe March, possibly April, that what COVID-19 was going to expose was a clash of two systems: a system of control, aka the PRC, and a system of information, the US, the West, or in your example, Taiwan and mainland China. But the record so far has been the countries and cultures of control have had a better record on mortality than the countries where freedom of information is the cultural norm. And I wonder what you make of that, and whether or not there's something here that is going to change the way in which we think about the relationship between the individual and the state and information.
I think it's very difficult to stand that generalization up. I think the variance in terms of excess mortality doesn't follow any neat political pattern of correlation. I think the problem that we realized very clearly last year was that if you have information dominated by network platforms, if you have the flow of information dominated by Facebook and Google, there is a problem. And I tried to show this in my last book, The Square and the Tower, 3 or 4 years ago. If you allow the public sphere to be dominated by large platforms whose business model is to sell ads, and in order to sell ads, they are incentivized to maximize user engagement by fair means or foul, the algorithms will promote fake news and extreme views. That's the problem. And so those warnings that I tried to issue kind of went unheeded. We didn't really fix this problem at all. We believed Mark Zuckerberg when he said he was going to fix Facebook. And sure enough, the super spreaders, when it comes to disinformation about vaccines, or for that matter, about any other aspects of the pandemic, are there in Facebook groups. It's a very, very obvious problem that is of relatively new provenance, because it's only relatively recently that the public sphere became dominated by these companies. The more that is the case, I think the bigger a problem we have. A key argument of doom, and I nearly added 2 chapters on this point, but was dissuaded because it would make the book too long, is that we had 2 pandemics, and we still have 2 pandemics. One is the biological one, the virus. The other is the pandemic or infodemic of misinformation and disinformation. The public got really confused. It lost trust. It already had low trust in government, but it lost trust more in public health agencies. And then it went off to the weird and wonderful world of Facebook influencers and YouTube influencers in search of better guidance. And that is why there are people, particularly vulnerable people, African Americans, Southern conservatives, holding out against the vaccine. I'm emailing somebody who works for me, pleading with her to get vaccinated. And she's not going to do it because she's swallowed the pill that tells her that a vaccination is going to be more hazardous to her than the disease itself. I mean, what can you do when that kind of idea gets widely distributed through a society? Yeah. How can you explain to people your risk of death is really significant at your age and in your situation? from this virus. And it's going up because the new variants are more contagious. And your risk of any adverse effect from the vaccine is like 2 in a million. And yet that's the problem. So I think almost all societies, regardless of whether they're authoritarian or democratic, have the problem that information is now dominated. Information flows are now dominated by a handful of companies whose fundamental motivation is at odds, I think, with the public good. What do we do about that? We still haven't done anything.
It's such an interesting thing, Neil, because I think that we are, certainly here in the UK, and I think actually in large parts of the world, we're massively underreporting this vaccine hesitancy issue in the US. And so there's a cultural moment here that we're missing where the US suddenly begins to see the scale of its information problem. It feels as though it's moving that way.
I wish I could agree. I think it's going to produce another wave of serious COVID infections and deaths, maybe in the southern states this summer, certainly in the fall. But even then, I'm not sure. I mean, it seems to me the problem is so staringly obvious and has been really since the 2016 election that the mystery is why we've done so little to address it. But I do think this has made it harder for effective policy to be executed. Ultimately, vaccine hesitancy will prevent the US getting to herd immunity. That's pretty clear now, given the way that the new variants spread, and Delta will spread through the United States in the coming months. The UK is just it tells the US what's going to happen next. It's done that throughout the past 18 months. And unfortunately, I don't think that the shock of another wave of deaths will be sufficient for people to question in any profound way how we govern the public sphere, which is now dominated by these few companies.
Neil, thank you. I realise we've gone over time, not least because we just tipped into another really interesting subject. Listen, thank you. I would normally say thank you anyway, just for sparing your time. I know that when a book like this comes out that feels so pertinent to all the things we're seeing, you're inundated by requests like this, so we appreciate your time. I doubly appreciate it when you just landed at 7 o'clock this morning. I know that you're probably going to conk out, fall asleep, but I expect you'll probably be up at about 3 o'clock in the morning. So, obviously we'll keep the lines open here. And if you've got the clock back in.
Well, even if I don't want to get up at 3, I'm sure my 9-year-old and my 3-year-old will be up expecting breakfast at 2 or 3 a.m. I've seen this movie before. I want to thank everybody on the chat and on the call. I was doing my best to eyeball the comments. But they were coming in so thick and fast that I probably only really saw about 20% of them. It's been a really exciting and interesting discussion. James, thanks for doing such a great job of leading it. And to those whose comments we didn't manage to tackle, sorry, we were doing our best, but we were battling jet lag and out-of-date Guinness.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody.